We don't rise to the level of our aspiration. We fall to the level of our business systems. If you're so tied into, in your business, this brute force of scaling of this hustle, it's just not going to work. It's not going to scale that part with it. Hustle can't scale past a certain point. But when we scale out before we scale up, now in fact we can.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Well, welcome to another episode of The Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel. I've got a real treat in store for you. Today, we're going to be talking about why hustle, it simply doesn't scale and what to do about it. What do I mean by hustle? It's the business owner that works really hard. I remember when I had my earlier company before I sold it in 2005. I started this one in 1997, I believe it was. And in the first 3 years of that business, my partner and I had this word. We called it grinding and cranking. We called it, I'm going to crank that out. I'm going to grind this out. We use those language, and we would use that in messages to each other. Hey, I just need to crank this out. Hey, I just need to grind through this process. And it was as if we took a bit of pride with how much work we could personally produce. Now, at the time, I was a bit younger. So, we're looking backwards there. I was in my late 20s, 28, 29, 30. And I remember working there and before kids, before being even married to my wife, Heather. We've been together now 25 years, but this is while we were just dating. So it was much easier back then in that respect. But that perverse pride does not serve a business owner. When I look at the value we created in that company back then by grinding out hours, by cranking through work, we created things that created $200,000-$300,000 worth of profit. But what happened was, because we put ourselves at the center of that business, the way that we produced is we worked harder and harder and harder and harder in the business, but we reached a point beyond which we simply could not scale anymore. We couldn't hustle anymore. I was already working 70, 80 hours a week. I was already on the road 2.5 weeks every month teaching workshops, etc. We just couldn't scale it anymore under that model. So if hustle doesn't scale, let's fast forward today. Today, I don't think anyone would accuse me of a hustler. I'm a bit lethargic, perhaps, in some ways. No, I'm teasing about that. But the different models as we put our business at the center. And if we put the business at the center, what happens is we can scale to a certain point. And then what that allows us to do is better team, better strong systems, more focused on the strategic choices for the company, better internal controls, which I'll get into all that today, lots of scale even more. And because the business at the center, I start having team members own functional areas of responsibility. And again, it lets the business essentially infinitely scale. Obviously, there is a limitation at some point, but the limitation lets it go well past the 10, 50, $100 million level. What's interesting is that, and this is a stat that should scare you, 95 out of 100 business owners will never break $1 million in revenue. Can you imagine? Think about that. I remember when I had companies that were under $1 million in revenue, they were not that fun to own. I was working exceptionally hard. They weren't very profitable relative to what they later turned to be. The stressful decisions came back to me. And what that also I think is interesting is only 1 out of 100 businesses will ever get past 10 plus million in revenue. And in fact, you want to go even bigger, only 1 of 500 businesses will break 50 million in revenue. This model will allow you to do that. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. And I want to talk about this idea that you need to scale out before you scale up, or certainly concurrently with scaling up. And this is an important one. So as you think about this, I'm going to get rid of one model here. I'm going to just take it off the table. I'm already going to assume that for you, settling to be one of the 95 out of 100 businesses that are under $1 million in revenue, that is off the table. It's not satisfying to you. It's not enough. That at minimum, your goal, your target is for how can you get the 1 out of 100 to be at least 10 million in revenue. If not even better, how can you be one of the 1 out of 500 businesses in the US that generate over 50 million in revenue? Otherwise, you wouldn't be part of this Maui community. You wouldn't be watching this podcast or listening to it wherever you are, whatever platform you're on. So to that end, how do we scale up? So first of all, remember we've talked in the past on this podcast about level 1, level 2, and level 3 businesses. And what we say is a level 1 business, this is where you do everything, really. I mean, you're doing pretty much everything, or you might have a few team members, but you're still responsible to make sure that it gets done. Level 2 here, though, you're responsible to directly do or directly manage everything. This is where most people get stuck. And what happens is they get their business and it's working, but it's working because they're hustling. It's working because they're scrambling. It's working because they're personally working very hard to produce or to directly manage the people who are producing. But that caps out. That's a level 2 thinking. That caps out. A level 3 thinker sees it differently. A level 3 thinker says, how can I be a leader who builds other leaders, and these other leaders are the ones who are managing the people who are getting stuff done, where they're the ones helping to build and refine and to implement the business systems that are in there. So with that understanding from that part, that we want to reach level 3 with this because it's important. Otherwise, you're going to be constrained by what we call that level 2 self-employment trap, where you've really built the job for yourself, not a business. Let's talk about what does it mean to scale out before you scale up. And I think this is an important distinction here. So I'm going to do a little bit of erasing here on this board as I know I tend to get a little bit animated and write down stuff. I know some of you are only on the audio only version of the podcast. That's fine. I'm hoping that I'm giving enough description behind it that it makes sense. But another way for you to think about this is, what does it mean to scale out? So let's talk about scaling out. First of all, when we think about scaling out, we're going to talk about this as 4 things. 4 things that help them with that. So one, first of all, is to make sure we're systems driven. Now, a friend of mine shared a quote with me recently, and I thought this was a fantastic quote. He says, we don't rise to the level of our aspirations. We fall to the level of our business systems. And I thought that was a really interesting way of framing this here. It is so important to have good internal business systems. And what does that mean to have good internal business systems? It means everything from, for example, if you're producing a product, how do you manufacture it? What are the processes for that? We coached for years a company that had a CNC manufacturing plant where they basically cut metal parts for various industries, aerospace and other industries, and they made these parts. And so each of their machines had certain programs that were already set to go for that. They had certain instructions for what tooling needed to be going along and how to have the fixtures that would set up to make their parts on their machines. Those are systems. If you're a service-based business, the systems might be for how you produce your accounting service, or how you produce, if it's a medical practice, how a new patient comes in. Earlier today, I was making some appointments for myself for some medical things that I need to be doing. And it was interesting. One of the places was they had a very clear system for how they schedule with me, the follow-up email that gave the instructions for me, the links for the online patient portals for me and what I needed to do. They had a policy about paying a deposit because it was a cash pay medical service, etc. It was clear that was a fairly cookie cuttered out. They had strong systems driven for that one. It was also clear that one of the other places I was reaching out didn't have that going on. In the absence of systems, you're left with real variation. And variation in your production of your business is not necessarily a good thing. Usually it's a bad thing. Why? Because sometimes you knock it out of the park and sometimes you strike out. Now, better than that is to all the time at least get it on base or knock it out of the park and to never completely strike out. That's what you're looking for, a consistency in what you do. Now, that consistency can be in your marketing systems. For example, your certain base level of lead generation. I know I've talked in an earlier episode of the podcast about feast or famine cycles, right? Wherein a middle stage level 2 business owner, they scramble to find new customers, new clients, and they do that. And then they're so busy producing on the work that they promised to these new customers that they stop doing those sales and marketing things that bring in new business. And so they finish with these new customers, and now they're left, oh my gosh, that feast is now a famine. And they're scrambling like crazy to pick up where they left off and find new customers. But when we have good business systems, a base level of sales and marketing activities happens all the time versus feast or famine with that. So that might be, for example, you have some online ads that are going on through Instagram or Facebook or one of the other modalities, or maybe for you it's trade shows that you're marketing through, or maybe through you it's a direct mail campaigns that are going on, or email marketing or SEO work that's going. But you have these things systematized out so that they're going in the background where they're not owner driven, they're being driven by the systems themselves. Really important. And so the first kind of important part of scaling out is, are we systems driven? Now, systems driven is going to start with the owner pushing and championing this. But the best part is, initially it might start off with the owner being the champion, but later on it's going to be a second person and a third person championing this. And when you start doing that, these systems start to speed up. You don't need the perfect business system that you create and then put into place and never look at. You need a culture that says, in our company, we consistently build systems, train people on the systems that we have, refine and simplify and improve systems that we have, and when need be, we retire and archive systems that are no longer valid. The business landscape changes too much. I mean, you think about all the changes that have happened even in the last 12 months, let alone the last 5 years. The systems that you had once upon a time, they were useful and effective once upon a time, but they might not be the system that you need today. What you need is a practice inside your company that says, in our company, the culture says, we're systems driven. Now, in addition to systems, we're also going to want to make sure that the second part of scaling out are something we'll call internal controls. Controls with an S. Internal controls are those special systems that say, are we doing the right things at the right time using our systems to generate the needed result? And when it's not working, it sounds the alarm, so to speak. Maybe it's a yellow flag warning. Maybe it's a red flag warning or a black flag warning. All hands on deck. Danger, Will Robbins, danger. For those of you that remember that old Lost TV show. But controls are really important in there. They're another place of scaling out. And what they do is they allow you not to have to try to keep everything in your mind at all times, but it puts the system in control, because a control runs in parallel with the system to make sure your staff is using your systems at the right time to get the result that they want. And if not, it brings it to the level of attention so that you and your managers and leaders can do something about it. The third part of scaling out is what I'll call ownership. Ownership. And I've said this before in other places. I don't want you to have just employees. I want you to have owners. Well, David, are you saying that I should be giving equity to all my team members? No, I'm not saying that. Here's the distinction I want you to get from this. I don't want all my people to be employees. Employees need to be task-driven. Employees need to be directed with everything. Employees, you start running in situations wherein they say, well, I followed the system. I checked off all the steps, checked all the boxes. Hey, it's not my fault that it didn't work. The system didn't work. I followed it. But owners, and by owners here, I mean team members who own functional areas of ongoing responsibility in the business. I mean team members who own generating the result versus just checking the boxes. When they do the systems that you have and something isn't working, they're paying enough attention and they say, hey, what we have isn't working. What do I need to do to tweak, adjust, adapt to make this work? Think about it as a Marine, right? How do I adapt and overcome? I'm not going to just follow the letter of the order. I want to serve the purpose of the order. I want to own the result as opposed to just own the step. Team members who own the step can create lots of frustration. I mean, have you ever had the situation where you turn to a team member and you say, hey, what's going on? The results here are horrible. And they say, well, gosh, I did step one, I did step two, I followed the process just like it's laid out. I checked the boxes. And you look at them and say, well, hang on, did you not even give any thought? Did you not pay attention? That wasn't working. And that's the difference between just having a pure employee and making sure that you're delegating ownership of a result to that employee. Hey, Carol, you're responsible to use this system to get this result. If the result is left or right, outside of boundaries, here's what you do about it. First, you're going to let us know about it. Second, you're going to try to figure out why it's not working and what adjustments do you want to try and make. And you're going to keep in close communication. And if it's still not working, or if it reaches a further threshold, then you and I are going to sit down and figure it out together. That's delegating ownership. And the beautiful part is that in a business, someone's going to have to play the role of gap catcher. Business is not clean enough where that your systems work perfectly every time. Stuff is different. There are gray zones. There are things that will fall between the cracks. When you delegate ownership, the best part about delegating ownership is it means that when there's things that fall between the cracks, the team member who owns the functional responsibility, who owns the result, they're responsible for catching whatever fell through the cracks and handing it off to a team member or seeing that it gets covered or handled. And if they reach a situation where they don't know what to do with it, there's no system for it, and they don't have the knowledge for it, they're responsible to raise their hand, so to speak, and say, hey, Mrs. Owner, I don't know what to do with this. How would you suggest I handle it? Left on my own, this is what I think I should do, but it's brand new. It's a novel situation I haven't dealt with. And then you as the owner can go back to them saying, hey, what you suggested is a great way to proceed. Do it. Let me know how it works. Or, what you suggested, we've tried that before and it hasn't worked. Why don't you try this instead? Let me know how that goes. But I can remember the years where early on, I was the gap catcher for everything in the business, and it was exhausting. Going back to the idea that hustle doesn't scale, hustle is when the owner is by default the person who's the gap catcher in all these different functions. So scaling out is systems driven. It's having good internal controls in place that allow you to see, to know that the right thing was done. It provides the guardrails, the bumpers on the side to make sure that you stay right in your correct lanes. And if it ever starts to veer outside, it raises the flag that we need to do something about that. We need to do something different. There's one more, and it's a really important one. There's one more element of this scaling out, and we'll call this number 4, which is on number 4 says, I need to have good strategic structure. Now, if you've been a long-time listener to the Business Coach or read any of the books that we've done, Scale, Build a Business, Not a Job, or the Freedom Formula, you know strategic structure. What we mean by that is this. What's the way that we align our company's best resources of time, talent, attention, money, and other resources to have our best resources focused on our best growth opportunities? In too many companies, the best resources get frittered away. And so, for example, in a middle stage level 2 business, this is the business owner where his best attention is probably the most important resource in the company. And yet he's sucked into low value emails or solving problems for low value customers or stuck. I'll give an example story. One of our clients, I remember working with this guy. We worked with him for close to 10 years. His name was Tom. And Tom, in his business at the time we started working with him, was doing $5 million a year in revenue. And the business was successful. It was a wholesaling business. It was successful. He was making money, profitable for a number of years. But I remember how Tom would be in the warehouse checking many of the different orders that were going out to make sure that they were going out just right. And I called him on that. I said, Tom, of all the things you do, is that really where you create the most value? And his comment to me was, no, David, where do I create the most value? And after a few more questions, what became clear is there were three things that he did that created the most value. Buying inventory at the correct prices, because a lot of his inventory was secondhand. So he really knew that he could buy for X. And if he paid any more than X, he was going to lose money on it. But if he paid X or less, he was going to make a lot of money on that. Second thing that he did that created the most value was pricing the key products that they sold or resold on their website correctly. That was the second way he created the most value. And the third thing that he did that created the most value was on decisions of who to hire for his leadership roles in the company. And I said to him, Tom, how much time are you spending in the warehouse or on your email doing low value junk? And, he's spending the majority of his 60, 70 hour work week. He made some adjustments and some changes to this. Fast forward 4 years, he fourfolded the company. He 4x'd it, right? He went from 5 to over 20 million in revenue. Profitability went sky high at the same time. He reduced his working hours to under 20 hours per week. I said, what are you doing now in the business? He said, well, primarily I'm working on what numbers should my buyers buy at. I've delegated some of the buying responsibilities to other people, but I'm in there with them to make sure they're buying at the right prices. And then I'm working with our team that puts our products up for resale on the site on the pricing, trying to get what's in my head to them. So those are the two places I'm probably spending the most time. Oh, and I've made some key hires in here, the person to run our warehouse, the person to run operations, the person to run our marketing. One of my future hires is going to be a COO, probably a CEO to replace me in the business, which he subsequently did do and reduced his working hours down to about 5 or 10 hours per week. But my point being, if you're so tied into, in your business, this brute force of scaling of this hustle, it's just not going to work. It's not going to scale that part with it. So, it's very common early on that in terms of strategic structure early on, the owner's best attention is spread way too thin. When Tom focused on buying at better pricing, selling at better pricing, and hiring better people, those three things helped him fourfold his business over the course of 4 years, roughly, a little bit under 4 years to do that. So for you, strategic structures is how do we put our best resources on those places of best growth? And then if you've been around the community at all, you know that we reduce that down to a one-page strategic action plan. We call that an SAP, a strategic action plan. Every quarter, here's my top company 2 or 3 focus areas, the criteria of success for each, and what are the main action steps and milestones of who does what by when by the end of the quarter. And we reduce that to a proprietary one-page format. That structure of having that 90-day plan that we execute on week by week by week. Remember the big rock tools we've talked about in prior episodes of the Business Coach podcast, or you might have read about in one of our books. That does wonders. And so now when we've scaled out, at the same time, we've done this work scaling up. Now we have sustainable growth. Without doing this work here down below, we'll cap out. We'll reach a point that we can grow 20%, 50%, maybe 100 or 200%, but you'll reach a ceiling past which you simply cannot scale anymore because, again, hustle, scramble, you personally producing simply does not scale to a certain degree. It only scales to a limited amount. You can double. You might be able to triple. I've seen that work. But things are always on the edge of breaking. But when we scale out at the same time we scale up, now we have a business that truly is sustainable at this bigger level. And this is how we blow through and hit a $10 million revenue company, a $50 million revenue company or more. We do that by scaling out, not just scaling up. And that's a new way of thinking. So my takeaway I'm hoping for you from this episode of The Business Coach is that you approach your business not just to grow revenue or profit directly, but at the same time you're working to grow those things, you're doing this work to improve your internal systems. You're implementing internal controls. You're doing a good job with what's going on there to make sure you delegate ownership, not just the task or responsibility. And you're using strategic structure to focus and align your best people and resources around your highest value contributions, around your highest value opportunities. And when we do that, this is how we'll be able to sustain a 10, 20, 50% annual compounded annual growth rate over the course of 5, 10, 15, 20 years with that part. And that's how we go from $1 million company to a $10 million company, a $10 million company to a $50 million company, a $50 million company to a $250 million company. This is the formula that works. Remember, hustle can't scale past a certain point. But when we scale out before we scale up, now in fact we can. So I want you to think about what's one takeaway that you can put into practice from today's podcast. It's not enough just for you to passively listen. You've got to do something. If you haven't already, please get to our website, mauimastermind.com. Get a copy of our business growth toolkit. It will give you some concrete tools to help on the scaling out process. Or pick up a copy of Scale and read that. There'll be some good pieces there. Or if you're really ready to go faster, then perhaps you might want to reach out to my coaching staff and to do a free coaching session. That way you can experience what's it like to work with a coach. And we can get a sense of what would it be like to work with you if we decided to ask you to be part of the program. In any case, take one step from today. I'll see you next week, everybody. Thank you for joining me today on The Business Coach.